He had been gone for 11 years. Not continuously. There had been leave. There had been a Christmas in 2019 that lasted 4 days before he got the recall notification. There had been a long weekend in 2017 when he drove from Camp Lejeune to the Texas Panhandle in a single stretch of 17 hours because his mother had asked him to come and she had never asked him for anything before. But the leaving had been continuous even when the body was present, the way a man can stand in a room and still be gone from it, and the ranch had always known the difference. He turned off the state highway onto the county road at 6:30 in the morning, when the sky to the east was just beginning to separate itself from the land at the horizon, a thin line of pale gold beneath a long darkness, the kind of light that arrived before it committed to anything. The truck was a rental, a white F-150 from the Amarillo airport that smelled of air freshener and the particular synthetic neutrality of a vehicle that belonged to no one. His bag was in the bed. It was the same bag he had carried since 2017, an olive drab duffel with a broken zipper pull he had replaced with a paracord loop, and it held everything he currently owned that was not in a storage unit in Jacksonville, North Carolina, which he would probably not go back for. He had been medically separated from the Marine Corps 6 weeks ago. The paperwork said his separation was voluntary. This was technically accurate in the way that many technically accurate things contain something that is not quite a lie and is also not quite the truth. He had signed the papers. The discussion that preceded his signing of the papers, conducted over 3 separate meetings with 2 different officers and 1 civilian contractor from the Department of Veterans Affairs, had made clear to him that the alternative to signing was a medical board process that would arrive at the same destination in 9 months rather than 6 weeks and would be considerably less dignified in transit. He had signed. He did not think about that now. He thought about the road. The county road was caliche, pale and chalky in his headlights, running straight west between flat land that was beginning to show the faint green of winter rye in the pastures that had been seeded. The mesquite along the fence lines was bare and gray, not yet budded, the twisted branches against the pale sky, making the particular silhouette that he had grown up with, and that was one of the few things he had ever genuinely missed about this place. He had not known he missed it until this drive, which was perhaps the nature of the things you miss. They remain abstract until you are close enough to them to feel the specific weight of their absence. The gate came up on the left at the 3-mile mark, right where it had always been, where it would probably always be. A cattle gate, galvanized steel, with a rusted chain and combination lock that his father had set to the last 4 digits of his Social Security number in 1994 and had never changed. Ethan knew the combination. He had known it since he was 9 years old. He got out of the truck into the cold morning air. His breath showed white. The ground under his boots was hard with the night's frost, the dead grass crunching. He undid the chain and swung the gate open, got back in the truck and drove through, got back out and closed and rechained it, got back in. The drive from the gate to the house was a 1/4 mile on a 2-track path through the pasture. The grass was long on both sides, gone winter gold and leaning with the slight prevailing wind from the northwest. A windmill stood at the corner of the near pasture, its blades turning slowly. He could hear it through the cracked window, the creak and tick of it, a sound he had heard every morning of his first 18 years and had not thought about once in the 11 years since. The house appeared as the track curved around the shoulder of a low rise. It was a low, wide ranch house, white-painted board and batten that had gone gray at the edges, with a covered porch running the full length of the front and a rusted tin roof that his father had never gotten around to replacing. The porch had a wooden swing at the left end and 2 ladder-back chairs at the right end, and between the chairs was a small wooden table that held, or had held, an ashtray his father used for the pipe he smoked on evenings, a habit he had kept secret from Ethan's mother until 2011 and that she had known about since 1998. Ethan stopped the truck 20 feet from the porch and left the engine running and the headlights on. He sat. The house was dark. It had been dark since October, when John Calloway had walked in from the north pasture at the end of a Tuesday afternoon complaining of a pain in his left arm that he described, characteristically, as a nuisance, and had sat down in the kitchen chair and died before the neighbor could get there, which was 11 minutes after she called the ambulance and 37 minutes before the ambulance arrived. He was 71 years old. He had worked the ranch alone for the 2 years since Ruth died, refusing help from anyone who offered it, taking help from one person who did not offer but simply showed up and did what needed doing. He had not been a man who accepted things easily. This was something he and his son had in common, which had been the source of their primary difficulty with each other. The notification had reached Ethan through the chain of command while he was on his second week of a deployment rotation in an undisclosed location that he had signed paperwork agreeing not to name in personal communications. By the time the paperwork cleared, by the time the Red Cross message arrived, by the time his commanding officer sat across from him in a prefab building and told him what the message contained, his father had been in the ground at the Callaway family plot at the edge of the East pasture for 4 days. There was no emergency leave to authorize. There was only the fact. Ethan had gone back to work the next morning. He had not known what else to do, and the work was there, and the alternative was sitting in a prefab building thinking about a kitchen chair in 11 minutes, which was not useful to anyone. He sat in a rental truck in front of the dark house and looked at the porch. Then he saw the dog. It was the shape that registered first in the space between the two ladderback chairs, a low, compact shape that the headlights caught at an angle, illuminating the curve of a spine and the tuck of a head and the particular arrangement of legs that meant a dog lying down with its shin on its paws. Old. The gray of the muzzle was visible even at this distance in the headlights. The body was small and close to the floorboards, the way old animals lower themselves toward the ground as if the world is gradually pulling them gently back into it. Ethan's hands went still on the steering wheel. The dog had not moved at the sound of the truck, had not lifted its head at the headlights. For one moment, long enough to matter, long enough to press against his ribs from the inside. Ethan thought the dog was dead, had died there on the porch in its sleep, which would have been a graceful death in the right location for it, and still would have been one loss too many for this particular morning. Then the tail moved, a single slow sweep across the porch boards. Once, the head lifted slowly, stiffly, the way old animals move when they have been still for a long time and the joints have cooled. The amber eyes caught the headlights. The dog looked at the truck. Ethan turned off the engine. The headlights went out. In the sudden dark, before his eyes adjusted, there was nothing but the creak of the windmill and the sound of his own breathing and the cold coming through the cracked window. Then the morning light, thin and pale as it was, resolved the porch again, and the dog was still there, its head raised, its ears forward, looking at the space where the truck was. Ethan sat in the dark truck in front of the house where he had grown up and where both of his parents had died, and did not move for a full minute. He was not a man who cried easily. He had not cried at the notification about his father. He had not cried at his mother's funeral, which he had attended in his dress blues, standing at the edge of the family plot in the east pasture in a November wind while the pastor spoke, and his father stood 6 feet away without looking at him, not from cruelty, but from the particular incapacity of men who have spent their lives doing instead of speaking, for whom grief is a private transaction that should not be witnessed. He did not cry now, but he sat in the truck for a full minute, and when he got out he moved slowly, the way you move towards something you're not entirely sure is real. He walked to the porch steps. 3 steps, wooden, the second one with the soft give it had always had, the nail working loose since before he left. He had fixed it twice as a teenager, and it had always come back. He set his boot on it now, and felt the same soft give, and something in him registered it the way the body registers things it stored a long time ago. Not memory exactly, but something below memory, the deeper catalog. The dog raised itself. It was an effort. Ethan could see that from the top of the steps, the front legs first, pushing up, then the rear legs finding their footing one at a time, the whole body trembling slightly with the effort and the cold. A blue heeler, or what a blue heeler looked like at 15 years old, which was ancient by any working dog standard and was in its way a testament to something, stubbornness, or will, or simply the persistence of a creature that had decided its task was not yet finished. His name was Dusk. Ethan had named him that because he was a puppy in the summer of the year Ethan turned 12, and they had found each other in the hour before dark on the first day, and the name had seemed obvious in the way things seem obvious to 12-year-olds, which meant it was simply true. Dusk was standing now, all 4 legs shaking slightly, his gray muzzle pointing at Ethan from 8 feet away across the porch boards. His eyes, the amber of old honey, the color they had always been, were fixed on the man at the top of the porch steps with an expression that was not excitement, and was not relief, and was not the exuberant, uncomplicated joy that young dogs perform. It was something quieter and older than any of those things. The expression of an animal that has been waiting for so long that the waiting itself became the purpose, and the arrival was almost secondary to the fact of having held. "Hey, buddy," Ethan said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. He cleared his throat. Dusk stood on the trembling legs and looked at him. Ethan crossed the 8 feet of porch boards and sat down on the floor in front of the old dog, his back against one of the ladder-back chairs, his legs folded. He put out one hand, palm up. Dusk took the 3 steps between them with the careful deliberation of an animal managing its body like a vehicle with known mechanical limitations, and lowered his gray muzzle into Ethan's palm. The shaking in the old dog's legs transferred into Ethan's hand, a fine tremor, the cold or the age, or both. Ethan put his other hand over Dusk's head and held it there. They stayed like that on the cold porch boards while the sky lightened and the windmill turned and the mesquite along the fence lines threw their gray shadows longer and then shorter as the winter sun came up flat over the eastern pasture. Ethan Calloway had been born on this ranch, in the bedroom off the kitchen, because his mother had gone into labor 6 weeks early and the roads to the hospital had been compromised by an ice storm that his father later described as the worst he had seen in 30 years of West Texas winters. He had been delivered by a retired nurse named Agnes Pruitt who lived on the adjacent property and who arrived in 20 minutes and who would later become, over the course of Ethan's childhood, something close to a second grandmother without either of them ever making that formal. He had grown up between the house and the pastures and the cedar breaks along the dry creek to the south, which held water only from March to May in good rain years and was otherwise a pale, sandy channel that he and the neighbor's son had used as a road for a decade of summer afternoons. He had learned to drive in the north pasture at 13, crouched over the wheel of his father's old flatbed in the particular intense focus of a boy who understood that this was a real thing and not a game, that the machine would do exactly what you asked of it and no more, that responsibility preceded privilege by an interval that his father measured in years. He had learned to shoot in the same pasture, at 14, with a .22 that his father handed to him without ceremony one Saturday morning and without instruction beyond. "Here, watch me once, then you do it." His father was not a man who repeated instructions. He assumed that the world's mechanisms, once demonstrated, should be legible. This had been an efficient approach in some domains and a failure in others, and Ethan had spent a significant portion of his adult life identifying which was which. He had been good at the shooting, better than his father by 16. His father had noted this without comment, which was his version of acknowledgement. He had enlisted at 18, the week after graduation, at the Marine Corps recruiting office in Amarillo. He had told his father the night before he went to sign the papers, not to ask permission, but because the man deserved to know. His father had been sitting at the kitchen table with his after-dinner coffee, and he had listened to the whole thing without expression, and when Ethan finished he had said, "We're going to leave the land," and Ethan had said, "Yes," and his father had said, "That's a choice a man can make," and he had picked up his coffee cup and drunk from it, and that had been the whole conversation. It was the most they had said about it then or since. His mother had cried. She had cried in the kitchen after his father went to bed, sitting at the same table with her hands around a cup of chamomile tea, and Ethan had sat across from her and watched and had not known what to say, because there was nothing useful to say, and anything ornamental would have been a kind of dishonesty. He had reached across and put his hand over hers, and she had turned her hand over and held it, and they had sat like that until the tea was cold. He had left 4 days later. He had come back when he could. Christmas when the duty schedule allowed it. His mother's 63rd birthday, which he made by 11 hours after a flight from Bahrain that was delayed twice. The long weekend in 2017. The 4 days in 2019. Each time, his father had greeted him at the door or in the yard or at the gate, and they had shaken hands, which was not a cold thing between them, but was the full vocabulary of physical contact that John Calloway possessed for adult men, including his son. They had eaten together and worked together during the visits. His father always found something for them to work on: fence line or water tank or the old flatbed's perpetually failing transmission, and talked about the work and about the ranch and about the cattle prices and about the weather. They did not talk about the deployments. His father watched the news every night, but did not ask about what the news described, because he understood, in the way of men who have survived their own hard things, that the asking would require the answering, and the answering was the person's business to do in their own time or not at all. They had never resolved the thing between them that needed resolving, because neither of them had the tools for it, and because there had always been another visit coming where it might happen, until there wasn't. Ethan sat on the cold porch boards with the old dog's head in his hands and understood that the conversation he had needed to have with his father had been waiting in this house for 11 years, and now the house was empty, and the conversation was not going to happen, and the only living creature on this land who had known both of them in the same breath was the dog whose gray muzzle was pressed into his palm. He understood this without being destroyed by it. He had been processing versions of this understanding for 6 weeks, in a motel room in Jacksonville, and on the plane to Amarillo, and on the drive down from the airport, and it had arrived at something that was not peace, but was past the sharpest part of the grief, and into something flatter and more permanent. The country you lived in after, which was not a bad country necessarily, just a different one than the one before. He sat on the porch. The dog leaned against his leg. The sun came up fully over the eastern pasture, and the frost on the dead grass caught it and threw it back in a brief, cold brilliance. And the windmill creaked, and a killdeer called from somewhere near the dry creek, and the morning arrived the way it always had on this land, without asking, without apology, indifferent to whatever had happened in the night. The neighbor's truck came up the county road at 8 o'clock and turned in through the cattle gate, which meant she had a key to the combination lock, or had simply memorized the numbers the way people who pay close attention to the details of other people's lives acquire that kind of information. It was a white Chevy Colorado, older but maintained, with a dog box in the bed and a gun rack in the rear window, holding a .30-06 that had been there since 2003. May Pritchard was 73 years old, though she had the posture of a woman who had decided 60 was the last age that was going to impede her and had simply refused to update the decision. She was 5'4" and thin through the frame in the way of women who had worked outdoors their whole lives, her white hair cut short and practical under a brown felt hat that had a crease in the crown from decades of being taken off and put back on. She wore a denim work jacket over a dark flannel shirt, jeans, and lace-up leather boots that came to mid-calf and were dusty at the toes. She had lived on the adjacent property for 41 years. She had been Ruth Calloway's closest friend for 38 of those years. She had been the one who drove Ruth to chemotherapy in Lubbock when John refused to accept that his wife could not drive herself. And she had been the one who sat with Ruth in the last weeks and had been in the house when Ruth died, which John had not been because he was in the barn doing something with a piece of equipment that could have waited and that he had needed desperately to do anyway. She had called Ethan that day. She had also been the one who called him about his father from the same phone, 6 years later, using the same number. She had been feeding Dusk since the day after John died. She pulled up beside the rental truck and got out without hurrying, and she looked at the porch and saw Ethan sitting on the board with his back against the chair and the dog against his leg, and her face did something brief and controlled, and then she came up the porch steps, stepping over the soft second one without breaking stride, with the muscle memory of a woman who had been on this porch several hundred times, and sat down in the ladder-back chair above him. She was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that is comfortable rather than waiting. "You look like your father when he was tired," she said. "People keep saying that," Ethan said. "They keep saying it because it's true." She reached down and scratched Dusk between the ears with the practiced ease of a woman who had been doing it every morning for 4 months. "He was a terrible patient. Your father. When he was tired, he sat exactly like that, with his head back and his jaw set and his hands open, and he looked like he was deciding whether to be angry about being tired or just tired. "I'm just tired," Ethan said. "I know." She rested her hands on her knees. "Drive from Amarillo? Flew in last night. Slept at the airport motel. You could have called ahead. I would have opened the house. I wasn't sure what time I was coming." She nodded, accepting this without pressing on it, because she was a woman who understood the difference between reasons and explanations and did not require the latter when the former was present. They sat in the morning quiet. A red-tailed hawk appeared over the north pasture, riding the thermals, its silhouette perfectly still against the pale blue of the sky. "How long has he been doing this?" Ethan asked, looking at Dusk. May looked at the dog. "Sitting on the porch? Waiting." She was quiet for a moment. "Since the day after your father died," she said. "I came over in the morning to feed him and found him on the porch. I thought he'd just been out overnight and couldn't get in, so I opened the door and showed him the inside, and he went in and ate and drank and then came back out and sat down right there." She gestured at the space between the two chairs, where Dusk had been lying when Ethan arrived. "He's been there every day since, morning to evening. Then I bring him inside at night when it's cold enough to matter." Ethan looked at the boards between chairs. The faint oval indentation of a dog's body, worn into the finish over 4 months of daily occupation. "Did he know?" Ethan asked, and he meant it in the way that people mean it when they ask that about animals. Not a literal question, but not entirely not literal either. "I think he knew something changed," May said carefully. "Your daddy talked to him. In the evenings, on this porch. I could hear it from the driveway, sometimes when I came to drop things off. I never listened in, but I could hear the voice. The tone." She paused. "After your father died, the tone went away. I think Dusk understood that." Ethan looked out at the pasture. "He talked about you," May said. She said it without preparation, without softening, because she had decided on the drive over that she was going to say it plainly and let it land where it landed. "Your father." To Dusk on the porch. "I don't know exactly what he said, but I know the context because sometimes when I came up the drive his voice was higher than usual, more animated, and when I got close enough to make out what he was saying, he was talking about something you'd done. A letter you'd sent. Something he'd seen on the news." She looked at her hands. "He had a box in the closet of the back bedroom. I found it when I was getting the house in order after. Letters. Every letter you sent him from the time you enlisted. In a shoebox, in order, with a rubber band around each year's stack. He kept every one." The hawk over the north pasture banked and turned south and diminished. Ethan's jaw worked for a moment. He looked at the horizon. "He never wrote back," he said. "No," May agreed. "I wrote him for the first 3 years. Letters. He didn't write back, so I stopped." "I know. I didn't think he read them." "I know you didn't." She looked at him. He wasn't a man who could do the thing that would have fixed that. He knew that too, I think, toward the end. He talked about it. Not to me directly, but I was in the room when he talked to his brother on the phone once in the last year. He said, I'll try to remember it accurately. He said that a man could know he was wrong about something and still not have the mechanism to correct it, and that the not having was its own kind of prison. She paused. His brother said, well, call the boy. And your father said, I know, and he didn't call. Ethan was quiet for a long time. Dusk had moved while they talked, settling himself across Ethan's legs with the full weight of an old dog's trust, which was not light, and Ethan had let it happen without adjusting, bearing the weight on his thighs without complaint. Why didn't you tell me this before? Ethan asked, when you called. About my father. Because you were on the other side of the world, and there was nothing you could do with it except carry it alone, and you already had enough to carry. And because some things you say face to face, or you shouldn't say them. He looked at her. She met his eyes with the steady, unhurried directness of a woman who had been telling people the truth for 73 years and had long since stopped finding it difficult. What am I supposed to do with this place? Ethan asked. It was not the question he had been planning to ask. He had been planning, loosely, to ask about the condition of the cattle, the state of the fences, the property tax situation, the practical inventory of a ranch that had been unworked for 4 months. These were the questions that had existed as structure in his mind during the drive from Amarillo, things to establish and assess, and then make decisions about. This was the real question underneath all of those. That's your question to answer, May said. Not mine. She stood up, straightening slowly, her hands on the arm of the chair. But I'll tell you what I think, which is that you came here, which you didn't have to do. You could have sold it from a distance, or let it go to the county, or any number of things that wouldn't have required getting on a plane. You came. That's not nothing. She looked at Dusk, who was watching her from Ethan's lap with half-closed eyes. And he waited. That's not nothing either. She came down the porch steps, stepping over the second one, and walked to her truck without looking back. The engine started. She backed out and turned up the two-track toward the gate, and he watched the white truck diminish across the pasture and disappear behind the low rise. The cold was settling more firmly now that the sun was up, and the morning had committed to being the kind of day that looked bright and was not warm. Ethan's fingers were stiff from the porch boards. He could feel his ears. Dusk was a solid, warm weight across his thighs, not sleeping but resting, eyes half closed, his gray muzzle rising and falling with each slow breath. Ethan looked at the door of the house. He had not gone inside yet. He inventoried this honestly, something he was not quite ready for. The house contained his mother's kitchen and his father's chair and the shoebox in the back bedroom closet and 35 years of specific weight, and he would go in when he was ready and not before, and he was not yet ready. He sat with the dog until the cold won out, and then he lifted Dusk carefully from his lap, supporting the rear legs the way you supported the rear legs of old dogs who couldn't do the dismount cleanly anymore, and set him on the porch boards and stood. The screen door had a new spring on it that his father must have put on sometime in the last few years, because it closed with a solid click rather than the hollow slap Ethan remembered. The kitchen was exactly as he expected and still managed to be a shock. The same table, the same 4 chairs, the same electric percolator on the counter that his father had used since 1988 and that Ethan's mother had tried to replace twice and his father had retrieved both times from wherever she had put it. The calendars on the wall behind the door were from the local feed co-op, the way they had always been, the current one still on October. He stood in the kitchen for a long time before he moved. He found the coffee in the cabinet where it had always been. He made a pot in the old percolator, which gurgled and hissed with the familiar mechanical personality of a machine that had been doing the same thing for 35 years. He found a mug, his father's mug, brown ceramic with a hairline crack in the handle that had been there since 2009, and filled it and went back to the porch. Dusk was still where he'd been placed, standing at the screen door, and when Ethan opened it, he came in without prompting and went directly to the kitchen and to the corner where his water bowl was, a green ceramic bowl with a small chip at the rim, and drank, and then turned and looked at Ethan. "Come on," Ethan said. He took his coffee to the porch, and Dusk came with him, and they sat, Ethan in his father's chair, which he had not sat in before and which felt, not wrongly, like putting on something that fit, and watched the morning settle across the land. The east pasture, the fence line along the highway, the windmill at the north corner, turning, the dry creek bed to the south, the bare cottonwoods along its banks standing pale and vertical against the blue. 42 acres, which sounded small until you stood in the middle of it, and turned around slowly and understood that the flat land went to the horizon in every direction and the sky occupied a volume that had no ceiling. He had forgotten this. Specifically, he had forgotten the sky, which was the thing about this land that was irreducible and unreplicable. The sky of the Texas Panhandle that sat on you like a presence, vast and participatory, making you aware of your own scale in a way that was not diminishing, but was something else, a recalibration of proportion that the human mind required periodically and could not get from ceilings. He'd spent 11 years under ceilings, mostly barracks and prefab and aircraft and vehicles, and the inside of a mind that had learned to scan and clear rooms as a primary mode of navigating space. The sky was not a room. There was nothing to clear. He drank his coffee. Dusk sat against his leg and breathed. The back bedroom was the last room he went into. He spent the first day in the house cataloging the practical, the state of the pantry, which may have stocked with basic provisions sometime in the last week based on the freshness of the bread and the dates on milk. The state of the utilities, all of which were still on because the estate attorney in Amarillo, a woman named Sandra Chun who had handled his father's affairs with brisk, competent kindness, had kept the accounts current pending Ethan's decision. The state of the cattle, 17 Angus cross in the north pasture, which was 4 fewer than his father had been running in his last productive year, the reduction suggesting that John had been scaling back as the work became more than one man could reliably sustain. He went out to the north pasture in the afternoon and walked the fence line. Dusk came with him, moving at his pace without prompting, the old legs finding their rhythm. The fence was in reasonable shape. His father's maintenance standards, applied with the decreasing physical capacity of his last 2 years, had left 2 sections that needed restringing, but nothing that would let cattle through in the near term. The cattle came to the fence to look at him. He stood and let them. They were his cattle now. The land was his. The windmill and the dry creek and the cedar breaks and the calendar still on October and the shoebox in the back bedroom closet were all his now, which was a fact he had been carrying since the phone call from Sandra Chun, and which had not yet become real to him in the way that things become real only when you are standing in the physical fact of them. He was standing in the physical fact of it now. That evening he built a fire in the wood stove in the living room, using the same kindling box beside the stove that had been there his whole childhood. The wood had been split and stacked on the side porch by someone, probably May, probably in November when the season made it necessary. He built the fire the way his father had taught him, which was the way his grandfather had taught his father. Newspaper at the base, kindling in a grid, 1 piece of split cedar to start the draw, then the heavier pieces once the draw was established. His father had never varied this sequence. Ethan had never varied it either. The fire caught, and the living room warmed, and the light changed to the amber and shifting red of a fire, which is the oldest light, and the one the human nervous system responds to most deeply. The one that says, shelter, warmth, the night held back, rest. Dusk lay in front of the stove on the braided rug that had been there for 20 years. Ethan sat in the other chair, his mother's chair, not his father's, and looked at the fire for a long time. He went into the back bedroom at 9 o'clock. The room was exactly his parents' room. His father had not redecorated, not moved things, not altered the arrangement of his wife's belongings in the 2 years since she died. Her reading glasses were still on the nightstand beside the bed, folded on top of a paperback novel with a bookmark partway through it. The bookmark was a laminated prayer card from her mother's funeral in 2003, which she had used as a bookmark for 20 years not for morbidity, but because it was the right size and always at hand. Ethan stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he went to the closet. It was a standard ranch house closet, not large, with a shelf above the hanging rod and a space below it for boots. The boots were there, his father's work boots, 2 pairs, and his dress boots that he had worn to church and to funerals and to his wife's cancer appointments in Lubbock. On the shelf above, several boxes, and at the back of the shelf behind a spare blanket, a shoebox. Brown, the kind that had once held a pair of work boots, with the word Wolverine on the end in faded black print. He carried it to the bed and sat down. The rubber bands were there, 1 per year, binding the letters into annual stacks that had faded at different rates. The early ones yellowed, the more recent ones still close to white. He counted the stacks. 11 years of stacks, which accounted for every year he had been gone, including the 3 years when he had stopped writing and his father had preserved the silence on both sides. Except there were letters in those year stacks too. Ethan looked at the dates. His own handwriting on his own envelopes, his own return address from whichever base or forward location he'd been at that particular month. He opened the stack from 2014, when he had stopped writing, and found letters dated January and February from him, and then nothing from him from March through December, and then a folded piece of paper unaddressed in his father's handwriting. He sat on the bed in the room where his mother's reading glasses were still on the nightstand, and he unfolded the piece of paper. His father's handwriting was the handwriting of a man who had learned to write in the 1960s from a teacher who believed in precision, blocky and deliberate and legible without being elegant. It said, "Ethan, I am writing this down because I can't seem to say it to you on the phone, and I don't know how to mail a letter so it reaches wherever you are. Your mother says I should send it to the base in Jacksonville, and they'll forward it. I don't know if that's right. I'm going to put it here and see if I find a way to send it later. If you're reading this, it means I found a way eventually, or I died, and you went through my things. Either way, you should know what it says. I was wrong to make you feel like leaving the land was a betrayal. It was not. A man chooses his service, and you chose yours, and I knew when you left that you were suited to it better than I was suited to farming at your age. I knew it, and I was too proud to say so, because saying so felt like losing the argument, and I have since come to understand that there was no argument. You were 18 years old, and you knew what you wanted, and you left. That was correct. I am proud of you. I have been proud of you since before you left, and I have been proud of you every day since. I don't know how to say this to a face, so I'm writing it to a piece of paper in my room at 10 o'clock at night while your mother is asleep. You should know it anyway. Come home when you can. The land will be here. Your father. Ethan sat on the bed in the back bedroom of the house where he had been born, and he held the piece of paper in both hands, and he looked at his father's handwriting for a long time. The letter was dated March 2014. His father had never sent it. 12 years the letter had been in a shoebox in a closet, addressed to no one, waiting. Dusk appeared in the doorway. He had come from the living room, moving with the slow, deliberate negotiation of the dark hallway and the bedroom threshold, and he stood in the doorway with his gray muzzle lifted, reading the air the way dogs read rooms when they sense something has happened in them that needs acknowledging. He crossed the room slowly and sat beside the bed and put his gray muzzle on Ethan's knee and looked up at him. Ethan put one hand on the dog's head. He sat like that for a long time in his parents' room in the house where both of them had died, with his father's unsent letter in one hand and the old dog's head under the other, while the fire in the living room crackled and the windmill turned in the dark outside, and the stars came out over the panhandle in the particular violent abundance that you only saw this far from anything electric, so many that the sky between them was less dark than the sky usually was, the darkness itself, illuminated by what it contained. He cried then, not the way crying usually arrived in the movies of his childhood, not loudly or dramatically. The way it arrived in men who had been holding things for a long time and had finally come to the place where the holding could stop, quietly, steadily, with the particular relief of something released that had been compressed for too long. Dusk sat with his muzzle on Ethan's knee and breathed. He stayed. The first week was practical, which was what Ethan needed it to be. He repaired the 2 failing sections of fence in the north pasture on Monday and Tuesday, working from sunup to when the light went flat, using the tools from his father's shop, which were kept with the precision of a man who believed that a disorganized tool was a tool unavailable when needed. He had always respected that about his father. The shop was the one place where John Calloway's standards had been articulate and transmissible, where the instruction was clear. Here is where each thing lives. Here is why. Here is how you treat it so it lasts. He found a winter feeding schedule written on an index card tacked to the shop wall, in his father's handwriting, dated October of this year. The schedule was meticulous, which days each section of pasture was being rotated, what supplement was going into the creep feeder, when the mineral blocks needed checking. His father had written it in October and had intended to follow it, and had not followed it for long. Ethan followed it. May came by on Wednesday with a casserole and stayed for 2 hours at the kitchen table, drinking coffee and talking about the ranch's history in the way she talked about it. Not with sentiment, but with information, the practical accumulated knowledge of 40 years of proximity to a working operation. She knew where his father had had trouble with fence-cutting cattle. She knew which section of the creek bank flooded in a hard rain and how long it took to drain. She knew that the well pump's motor had been making a particular sound since August and what his father had said about it, which was that it would probably hold through winter and need replacement in spring. She did not treat him like a man who needed handling. She treated him like a man who had shown up to do a job and needed the briefing. This was exactly right. On Thursday, he drove into Dunn's Creek and introduced himself to the people his father had done business with, which included the feed store, the livestock vet, the propane company, and the woman at the county assessor's office who handled agricultural exemptions. Several of them had known his father for decades. Several of them said some version of the same thing. In different words, your father was a man you could count on. He took it as the high compliment they intended, which it was. Dusk came with him on every errand. The old dog rode in the passenger seat of the rental truck, and then in the passenger seat of his father's green F-250, which Ethan started driving on the third day because it felt more correct than the rental, more like the vehicle the land expected to see. Dusk sat upright in the seat the way he had ridden for 15 years, watching the road with the particular focus of an animal that found motion interesting, his gray muzzle pointed at the windshield, his ears tracking the sounds the truck made. In the evenings, they sat on the porch. The porch was where Ethan was beginning to understand the shape of what he was doing. He had not made a decision, formally. He had not called Sanderchun to tell her he was keeping the property. He had not arranged to collect his belongings from the storage unit in Jacksonville. He had simply been doing the next thing each morning. Feeding the cattle, checking the fence, taking the truck to town, sitting with the dog in the evening, and the next things were accumulating into something that had the shape of a life, if not yet the official designation of one. He thought about his father on the porch. The voice May had heard, higher and more animated than his indoor voice, talking to the dog about Ethan's letters, about things he'd seen on the news. He tried to imagine it. The man he had known, who communicated in hand gestures and short declarative sentences and the sharing of physical labor, sitting in this chair with his pipe and talking to a blue heeler about his son. He could imagine it. He had been wrong about his father in the way you could be wrong about people who communicated in a language you were not taught to read. Not wrong about who they were, but wrong about the full extent of what they contained. His father had contained things he had never shown, and a shoebox full of letters, and an unfinished conversation that had been waiting in a closet for 12 years. You could be wrong about people and still be too late to correct it. Both of those things were true simultaneously, and the living with them was the work. On the 14th day, he called Sandra Chun and told her he was keeping the property. She said good. She said it quickly, without elaboration, the way lawyers sometimes say things that they have been waiting for the client to arrive at. He had the impression that she had known this would be the outcome and had been professionally restrained about saying so. After he hung up, he sat on the porch for a while. Dusk was beside him. The old dog's breathing was audible today, a slight wheeze on the exhale that had not been there 2 weeks ago, or that he had not noticed 2 weeks ago, and which now registered with the particular quality of attention he gave to things that had become important. He called Dr. Garner, the livestock vet who also handled small animals as a practical matter of being the only veterinarian within 40 miles, and she had come out earlier in the week and examined Dusk thoroughly, and had spoken to Ethan with the honest, proportionate directness of a vet who respected her clients. 15 was very old for a healer. The hips were arthritic in both joints. The slight heart murmur she was hearing was new, or newly audible. He was eating well and drinking well, and his eyes were clear and he was comfortable. She could not give him a timeline, which she explained was not evasion, but genuine veterinary truth. Animals did not conform to timelines. She said, "He'll tell you when it's time, and you'll know what he means when he does." She said it without sentiment, the way a fact is stated, and Ethan had received it the same way. He looked at the dog now. Dusk looked back. The amber eyes, still clear, still reading him the way they always had, the way they had read his father in the evenings on this porch, the way they would read him now in the evenings on this porch, for however long the evenings continued. He reached down and scratched behind the ears. The old tail moved. Slow, the way everything moved for him now, but genuine, the sweep of it real. The mesquite was beginning to bud. He had not noticed until this week that the mesquite along the fence lines was coming back. The tiny green leaves at the tips of the gray branches, a color that existed for about 2 weeks in early spring before the leaves opened fully and became the deep waxy green of the mesquite in season. You had to know to look for it. It was easy to miss against the gray of the sky. He had grown up noticing it, had forgotten it for 11 years. He was noticing it again. The Callaway property ran to 42 acres on its title, but the land did not observe property lines. The east pasture merged into the highway right-of-way, and the right-of-way merged into the shoulder, and the shoulder merged into the county road, and the county road ran to the horizon where it bent slightly and disappeared. And the sky above all of this was continuous and uninterrupted and went on in all directions until the curvature of the earth brought it back to itself. He owned 42 acres of this. He worked 42 acres of this. The rest of it was available to him the way things are available to people who are present in a place and paying attention, not as property, but as world. He began to understand that this was something he had needed and had not known he needed until he was standing in the middle of it, with the morning light on the winter rye and the windmill turning and the old dog beside him, and the part of his mind that had been in a state of continuous readiness for 11 years, the part that scanned rooms and cleared corners and processed threat probability as a background function of consciousness, was beginning, slowly and not without resistance, to recognize that this was not a room, that there were no corners, that the sky went to the horizon in every direction and the windmill creaked, and the killdeer called, and the cattle moved in the north pasture with the slow, uninflected purpose of animals who did not need to be anywhere other than where they were. It was not the absence of danger that calmed this part of his mind. It was the presence of something that made no demands on it. He thought about his father, who had sent no letters and kept every one, who had talked to the dog in the evenings about his son, who had written a piece of paper at 10 o'clock at night and put in a shoebox and not sent it, and carried the not sending for 12 years. He thought about the mechanisms a person could lack for the things they needed to do, and how the lacking was not always indifference and was sometimes its own complicated form of caring. He thought about Dusk, who had sat on this porch for 4 months after John Calloway died, through the November cold and the December wind and the January ice that had come through and covered the caliche in a 1/4 inch of clear glaze, sitting in the space between the 2 chairs with the patience of an animal that had decided its task was to hold the position and wait. Not for rescue, not for explanation, simply for whatever was coming, whenever it came. Whatever had been coming had been him. It seemed, this morning, in the early light with the mesquite beginning to bud and the fire inside warming the kitchen and the dog's slow, audible breathing beside his boot, it seemed like something near enough to enough. He was not healed. He was not whole in the way he had been whole before the things that had marked him, and he understood clearly now that the before was a country he had left permanently and would not be returning to, the same as his father's country and his mother's kitchen and the unfinished conversations and the 11 years of absence. Those were the geography of what had happened. You did not unhappen things. You found out what was on the other side of them. On the other side of his was 42 acres in the Texas Panhandle, and the shoebox in the back bedroom, and the cattle in the north pasture, and the windmill at the corner, and May Pritchard's white truck appearing at the gate on Wednesday mornings, and the fence line that needed tending, and the well pump that needed replacing in spring, and the spring that would come whether he was ready for it or not. And the dog. The dog who had sat on this porch for 4 months waiting for something to arrive, who had pressed his gray muzzle into a stranger's palm in the dark of a pre-dawn morning and stayed there, who was lying now in the pale gold light of a West Texas morning with his eyes half closed and his ears tracking the familiar sounds of the land, breathing with the slow, deliberate ease of a creature that had reached the far end of its responsibilities and found, in the finding, that this was sufficient. Dusk died on a Tuesday in April, not in distress. He had eaten his breakfast and walked to the east pasture fence with Ethan on the morning check, and come back and drunk from his bowl, and then gone to his spot on the porch and lain down in the space between the 2 chairs where he had waited through the winter. And when Ethan came out at noon with coffee and sat in his father's chair, the dog's breathing had changed to something slower and more widely spaced, and he had put his hand on the dog's side, and Dusk had opened his amber eyes once, and looked at him and closed them, and the breathing slowed further and then stopped. He buried him in the east pasture, near the Calloway family plot where his parents were, which felt right. The ground was soft with the April rains. The cottonwoods along the creek had leafed out green, and the mesquite was in full season, and the killdeer were nesting somewhere in the dry grass near the fence line, the broken wing call carrying across the pasture in the quiet of the afternoon. He marked the place with a flat piece of limestone from the creek bed, the way his father had marked other things on this land, without ceremony, with permanence. He stood there for a while in the April afternoon. Then he went back to the house and made coffee in his father's percolator and took it to the porch and sat in his father's chair and looked out at the east pasture and the family plot and the piece of limestone at the edge of it, and the sky above everything, continuous and unrestricted and going on in every direction to the horizon. He had been gone for 11 years. He was not going again. There is a particular kind of faithfulness that asks nothing of the person it is given to. It does not require recognition or reciprocity or even presence. It simply holds the position and waits through the cold and the dark and the long months of absence, because holding the position is what it knows to do, and the waiting is not separate from the love, but is the love expressed in the only language available. A 15-year-old blue heeler on a porch in the Texas Panhandle, sitting in the same spot day after day through a winter that was nobody's idea of merciful, waiting for a man who might never come. That is what faithfulness looks like when it has no audience no guarantee, and no timeline. Ethan Calloway came home because the land was there and because there was nowhere else. But he stayed because of what was waiting on the porch when he arrived, and what it told him, without a word, about the people who had loved him in the ways they were able to love him, and the place that had been holding his shape in its absence the way land holds the shape of a river that has temporarily changed course. He stayed because sometimes you find out what you needed by arriving at the place that kept it for you while you were gone. And sometimes that place is 42 acres of dry grass and cedar breaks, and a porch with a soft second step that never stayed fixed, and a dog who sat in the same spot between two chairs until the person who was supposed to be in that chair finally came home. If this story moved you, please give it a like and share it with someone who has ever come home to something, or someone that waited for them without being asked. Subscribe for more stories about the loyalties that outlast distance and grief, and the ones that hold the line when we can't hold it ourselves. And before you go, the next story on your screen right now is one we think you'll carry with you for a long time. Thank you for being here.